This is the Bible. It is the most widely published book in the entire world. It is divided into 66 books, and it has two testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is important to think of the Old and New Testament as two sides of the same promise.
The Old Testament starts with God making all of creation and sets the tone for how humanity and God will interact with each other.
There are a handful of covenants or promises that God makes in the Old Testament. Many have already been fulfilled, both in biblical times as well in more recent times.
The New Testament is the fulfillment of all of God's promises, and we see that in the person and the work of Jesus Christ.
So we've talked about how the Bible is a collection of 66 individual books. We've talked about how it's broken into two testaments, that the Old Testament is the setting of the promise from God. The New Testament is about the fulfillment of that promise. But there's more to the Bible than just that. In these 66 books, we see a variety of genres and literature styles that we don't see in any other text in the world. For example, in the Old Testament alone, there's at least 4 or 5 different genres. We've got the books of law, which are the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which sets the tone for how we're supposed to interact with God, what is appropriate for worship, what isn't, stuff like that. But then you look at the next set of books, starting with Joshua and Judges and going all the way through to the end of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And those are books of history. And what's really kind of interesting is that the Bible is messy. You look at these stories, and while we consider some of the characters in the Bible like King David or King Solomon or Abraham or Moses or John the Baptist or the Apostle Paul, we look at them as these biblical heroes, and these guys were just as messed up as every other human being on the planet. They had their moments, they've had their sins. I mean, let's look at Paul, for example. He's one of the most prolific writers of the New Testament. He wrote 10 of the books that are in the New Testament. And he started off as a Pharisee, hating Christians, and his conversion to Christianity happened when he was on the road to Damascus, planning on arresting and possibly executing Christians simply for believing something different than what he believed. So I want to encourage you, if you haven't read the Bible, you might want to start. Start with something simple. Start with a verse or two and let that speak to you. But when you get into some of the text, like the stories in the Old Testament or even the accounts in the New Testament, put yourself in place of those characters. How would you feel if you were in that situation? There's some really interesting stories, really cool stories that would make for some great movies if we ever filmed them. So I want to encourage everybody who watches this video, pick up your Bible, read it. It is worth it, and you'll truly be blessed. Have a great rest of your week. God bless.